Today I'm joined by Professor Charles Efferson for the first podcast in HEC Lausagne's new Reimagining Sustainability series. Charles is a member of the Faculty of Business and Economics at the University of Lausanne, HEC Lausanne. He describes himself as an evolutionary ecologist and focuses on the evolution of human social cognition and human social behaviour. In this episode, we're going to be discussing what's known as polarization, which is the fragmentation of society along cultural and ideological divides, and how it's affecting efforts to build a more sustainable future. Charles, thank you very much for joining us here today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Previously, you've described the culture wars as a reflection of a polarized society. Now that Donald Trump is in the White House, how do you think this will play out?
I don't know that Donald Trump is the key issue here. It seems to me that the underlying polarization that was in place before Trump came along and will probably still be in place after he's gone, that's the more fundamental issue. So Trump is very talented at exploiting the polarization. But for me, at least, I see the polarization as the more fundamental issue. And how it will play out, who knows? I can say the following. My research has suggested to me that if you're trying to activate some process of behavior change, which is almost certainly going to be essential in terms of sustainability or improving sustainability in the future, reducing individual carbon footprints, for example, then polarization is really detrimental to that process for different reasons. But the basic idea is that people are invested in a particular stance on the polarized issue as a way of constructing their identities, basically. And that really limits the potential for some new socially beneficial behavior. Eating less meat, for example, that might be good for emissions. It really limits the potential for that behavior to diffuse or spread through the population. And the reason is pretty intuitive because people have invested their identities in a particular behavior, then changing behavior is not just a question of, what's a good behavior, what's a good choice to make here. Changing behavior really becomes, to put it a bit dramatically, more of an existential threat. And that really limits the potential for behavior change for various reasons.
And of course, it's not just the US that's become polarized and entwined in identity politics. Do you think that the sustainability agenda will continue to evolve in the current global climate?
Well, it will, but honestly, identity politics and polarization, as long as that manifests itself in issues related to sustainability, it makes me a bit pessimistic about the future, to be honest, because I guess what I'm saying before is that as long as this identity construction or this identity politics manifests itself with respect to domains that are important for a sustainable future, it's going to limit the potential for socially beneficial changes in behavior. And that's the problem. Imagine that polarization manifested itself in some other way that was less socially consequential, like whether we wear, blue t-shirts or red t-shirts. If people invested their energy in that decision, it wouldn't be, because it's not a domain that really matters that much in terms of sustainability, it would be a much better situation, even if we accepted the need to define one's identity based on things like that, based on the choices one makes. But as long as they're doing so in relation to choices that really matter for sustainability, I think it's a problem, whether it's the US or any other country. The US is sort of leading the way these days in terms of dysfunctional polarization, but as you mentioned, it's not alone by any means.
You spent many years focusing your research on some of these key issues. Tell us, in the research that you've done on applied cultural evolution with your colleague Sonja Vogt, you discussed the importance of what you call social planners. What exactly is a social planner, and how can they contribute to positive social change?
So a social planner, the choice of this sort of generic term is deliberate because we really intend this concept to be thought of in very broad terms. A social planner is anyone in a position of influence or authority who is prepared and equipped to intervene in society in some way. And again, very broad. You can think of that in the sort of conventional way. It's a government official who can make a policy change or a policy recommendation. That's included. It could be an NGO who's intervening in society in some way. It could be a CEO at a firm, but it could also be a more, someone in a more everyday role. Anytime you talk to your friend and intervene in your friend's life, give some kind of passing advice, for example, then that produces behavior change, at least potentially on a smaller scale, but you can also think of that as a kind of a social planner. And in particular, what we've worked on a lot is what happens if a social planner intervenes in some way, whether that's passing advice for a friend or some large-scale policy change. That intervention, in principle, has a direct effect. Some people are directly exposed to that intervention and they change behavior as a result. But it also, and this is what we've worked on a lot, this is where the term applied cultural evolution comes from. The intervention also, in principle, induces a secondary cultural evolutionary effect. And what we mean by that is people who aren't directly exposed to the intervention may still change their behavior because they're learning from or they're influenced by or they're paying attention to other people who were directly exposed to the intervention. So let's say I'm the social planner. I spend a lot of time trying to convince you why you should switch to a vegetarian diet. It's good for your health, it's good for the environment, etc. And one day I convince you and you say, you know what, Charles, you're right. I'm going to go all vegetarian. So that would be the direct effect of my intervention. But you also have people that you influence in one way or another. And they may also change behavior down the road. And that's this indirect secondary cultural evolutionary effect that under certain circumstances can produce a degree of behavior change that far outstrips the direct effect of the intervention. So that's the idea.
Have you done other research on behavior change which can be applied to behavior change in the context of sustainability?
My early work, which was for many years, Sonja Vogt and I on applied cultural evolution, were issues more related to gender bias and gender equality. But the same idea was at work there. So a lot of NGOs are trying to intervene in a subset of a population in a way that might reduce gender-based violence, for example, in the hopes that if they can get an initial group of people to change behavior, the process will take off on its own, sort of under its own steam, so to speak. Now, I came to the conclusion, sort of lots of unexpected results came out of that research program, and it led me to the conclusion that individual heterogeneity is really important in terms of whether this works or not. So, for example, if you have a population where people have just different values and different preferences, it really has a big effect on whether this diffusion of a new behavior actually works out or not. And I think this is, of course, also applies in the case of behaviors related to sustainability. We imagine that a sustainable future is going to require widespread behavior change, like eating less meat, changing the way we get from one place to another, etc. The question is, how do you get people to make these changes, to change their behavior in that way? You can't sit down with everyone and convince them that they need to change behavior. You're really talking about a change in the culture. And if you're going to do that, if you're going to activate that kind of process, if you have any hope of it working out, you really need to understand the pre-existing heterogeneity in the population. That gets back to the polarization. Polarization, for me, represents a pre-existing form of heterogeneity. It really gets in the way of this kind of large-scale behavior change because it sort of hinders this diffusion process. It just never takes off in that way. So I think it applies to many things related to sustainability for that reason.
Yes, and of course, change is taking place at warp speed at the moment, AI being a very good example. Do you think that there is a glimmer of hope that technology can help us to resolve some of these critical sustainability challenges that we face?
Well, that's a big question. I guess, for what it's worth, that there's no general answer to that question. Can it help? Of course, in the sense that if, a sort of key technological innovation helps us do something in a way that's good for sustainability, leads to fewer emissions or helps us with carbon recapture, etc. All of these things help. But that doesn't mean technological progress in general helps, right? Technological progress can lead to other problems just as surely as it can solve some problems. And I guess in a way, that's what your question is. What will be the net effect of technological progress? Because some people have argued, in a way, different views about a sustainable future come down in many discussions to questions about what's an article of faith for the individual. Does the individual think that technological progress is going to somehow save us? Or does the individual have a more circumspect view about what technological progress can achieve? Now, there's no doubt that AI, for example, is another new technology that can maybe help us solve problems faster than we would otherwise be able to do. But how the technology is applied, that's a completely open question. So I've done some work recently where I've tried to understand what are the sort of long-run dynamics of the human population in a system where technological progress has no fundamental limit, if you want to think about it that way. So it's a kind of a best case scenario for the future. And so this is just theoretical work. So take it with a grain of salt for that in that sense. But one of the things I've found from working on these models is that even if you have technological progress with no fundamental limit, if you embed that in a system that's an economic system, but that's embedded in a larger ecological system, that it's not at all clear that it leads to a good outcome. In fact, my research in this area suggests that those systems are sort of fundamentally unstable. It kind of turns the perspective of technological optimism on its head because it really is a best case scenario with respect to technological progress.
Goodness. Fundamentally unstable. Well, that's food for thought, but such an interesting conversation all the same. Thank you so much for joining us here today, Charles.
Okay, thank you very much. My pleasure.